Her left eye was put out for looking a white man in the face. A Lakota chief kissed the lid. I want to tell you about a scar. Not mine, though I have plenty. I want to tell you about hers because it's where everything starts, and because if I don't get that right first, none of the rest of it makes sense. The left side of her face. I saw it for the first time in firelight, which is not the gentlest light for a thing like that. She was across the camp, tending somebody's horse, running her hand down the near foreleg, and she turned her head just enough that the fire caught her profile, the left side, the ruined side, and I stood there with a half-eaten piece of dried elk in my hand, and I forgot to chew. The eye socket was intact. There was an eye in it, but the lid was wrong. It had been cut or burned or both. You couldn't always tell with the old punishments, and it had healed badly, puckered and drawn, so the eye itself sat behind it like something peering through a crack in old wood. White scar tissue around it, shiny in certain lights. The kind of mark that doesn't fade. The kind that says, someone did this to you deliberately and they wanted everyone to know. She felt me looking, turned and looked back. The good eye, the right eye, was black and level and entirely without apology. She held my gaze for 3 full seconds, which was 2 more than most men could manage, and then she went back to the horse's leg. I went back to my elk. That was in the autumn of my 53rd year, and I had been dying for about 6 months by then. Not the quick kind. The slow kind. The kind where your body is still walking around and doing things, but something central in you has gone quiet, like a fire that's burned down to coals and doesn't know yet it's about to go cold. I will tell you how I got there. It takes some time, bear with me. My name is Lakota. I was born on the upper Missouri in a year the whites would call somewhere around 1831. My father was a band chief, not a great war chief, not a holy man, just a man who led well and was trusted by his people, which is its own kind of greatness that the history books never write down. He died of the smallpox when I was 11. Before he died, he told me 3 things. He said, a chief is not the man who takes the most. He is the man who gives the most away. He said, when you want something badly enough that you're willing to lie to get it, that thing already owns you. He said, the hardest thing you will ever do is stay when everything in you says to run. I have thought about those 3 things nearly every day of my life since then. I have failed all 3 of them at one time or another. The 3rd one I failed so badly that I am only here now because a woman with a ruined eye would not let me finish the failing. But I am getting ahead of myself. By my early 30s I had become what my father was, a band leader, respected, listened to. We were hung Papa Lakota, and those were years when you had to be careful, when the treaties were already not worth the paper the agents sweated over, when the soldiers kept pushing west and the buffalo kept thinning, and you had to decide every season how much you were willing to bend before you broke. I was not a fighting chief in the way that some men were. I was a negotiator, a reader of situations, a man who could sit across a table from a white government man and keep his face still while that man lied to it. I had that particular skill. I could hear what was underneath the words. I could find the angle a thing was coming from before it arrived. It kept my people alive for a long time, longer than some bands. I married young. Her name was Winona. She was smart and funny, and she made a sound when she laughed that I can still hear if I get quiet enough, a kind of caught breath before it opened up, like she was always a little surprised to find something funny, even when she was the one who'd said it. We had 2 sons and a daughter. The boys grew up strong. The girl had her mother's laugh. I am not going to dwell on what happened to them, because that is not what this story is about, and because some things you keep. I will say only this. There was a night in the winter of 1876 when the soldiers came to a camp where my family was staying, a camp I had arranged for them to be in because I thought it was safer than staying with the main band. And I was wrong about that, badly wrong, and when I got there the next morning there was nothing left but smoke and what the smoke was coming from. And I will say that my daughter was 14 years old and my wife was 41 and my sons were 18 and 22. And I will say that all of them were gone. And that is all I will say about it. What I will say is what it does to a man. What that kind of wrong does to the inside of you, the part that runs the machinery. It doesn't kill you. That's the thing people don't understand. They think a grief that size kills you, and it doesn't. It hollows you. It comes in and takes up residence in the hollow place it made, and it sits there, and the outward man keeps walking and talking and leading and deciding, and the people around him don't always know how empty the inside got. But you know. You know every morning when you wake up and you have to remember all over again. You know every time somebody laughs at something, and you find you can no longer remember why laughter was a thing that mattered. I led the band for 4 more years after that. I don't know entirely how. Habit maybe. Stubbornness. The sense that if I lay down the people would be without anyone, and that seemed like one more wrong piled on the wrong. But I was running on less and less. The way a lamp runs on less and less, and I knew it. And I think some of the men around me knew it too, though they said nothing. There were nights in those 4 years when I lay awake in a camp that was too quiet and I tried to reconstruct Winona's face in the dark behind my eyes, and it kept going soft at the edges, the way a face does when enough time has passed, and I could not hold it still, and that was its own particular grief on top of the grief, losing the clear picture. I still had her laugh. The sound of it, that stayed the sharpest, but the face went soft. And I would lie there in the dark trying to hold it and failing. And by morning I would be standing again, pulling the outward man back into position, and the band would see a chief and not a hollow. You get good at that, you get too good at it. In the spring of 1880, I made the decision to surrender to the agency. I want to be clear about what that cost. It wasn't cowardice. I want you to understand that. It was the last real strategic decision I made as a chief. I looked at what we had and what the soldiers had, and what the next 10 years were going to look like, and I calculated, the way my father had taught me to calculate, and I decided that more fighting meant more of my people dead for an outcome that was going to be the same either way. I was not wrong about the outcome. I have never been wrong about that particular outcome. But the cost was everything I was. A chief without a nation is not a chief. A leader who has led his people to surrender is a certain kind of man at the end of that road, and he is not the same man he was at the beginning of it. I walked into that agency a hollow man, and the agency had a way of making you feel even more hollow, because it was designed for that, because a hollow man is an easier man to manage. They gave me a piece of land on the western edge of the reservation, 40 acres, decent grass, a creek that ran clear in good weather. I built a cabin I'd learned to build by then, the way you learn things you never thought you'd need. The logs were green pine, and the chinking between them was clay from the creek bank that cracked in dry weather and had to be redone. I spent 2 weeks on that cabin. It gave my hands something to do, which was the only thing in its favor. When it was done, it was a shelter and nothing else. I did not decorate it. I did not put anything on the walls. It had a wood stove and a window and a plank floor, and I lived in it, and it kept the weather off, and that was the full extent of what I asked from it. And I started the process of becoming a man who had been something once. That is the most honest way I know to put it. She came to the agency in the late summer of 1880, a few months after me. Her name was Chaska. That's a name in our language that you give to a firstborn son, but her mother had given it to her because she said the girl had come into the world like she was trying to start a fight, which her mother had considered a son's way of arriving. It suited her. Everything about her was a little wrong by the expected measure, and everything about her was exactly right by the real measure, and those two things were in permanent conflict, and she had clearly made her peace with that a long time ago. She was from a different band, Oglala, not Hung Papa, and she had come in with a small group of survivors, maybe 20 people, most of them old or injured or both. She was somewhere around 40, I guessed. though she carried her age differently than most women, in the jaw rather than the eyes, in the deliberateness of her movements rather than any slowing of them. She moved like someone who has learned to read ground before she steps on it. The eye, the scarred eye, I asked about it eventually. Not that first day, not the first week. It was closer to a month before I knew her well enough and trusted her enough and thought she trusted me enough to ask. She told me the story without much inflection. The way you tell a story you've told before and have decided is not allowed to hurt you anymore. She had been maybe 22, working in a trading post the agency ran, when a white man, a government man, a land surveyor of some kind had come in, and she had looked at him directly when he spoke to her. Not in a challenging way, just as a person looks at another person they are speaking to. He had found this intolerable, apparently, the idea of an Indian woman meeting his eyes. He'd had 2 men with him. They'd held her down on the counter of the trading post, and he had done what he did with a lit cigar, and she had never had full use of that eye again. The trading post agent, a white man from Ohio, had written up a report that said she had provoked a confrontation. No charges were ever filed. She was sent to a different agency. The surveyor had, as far as anyone knew, continued surveying. She told me this the way I told you about my family, with the same flatness, the same decision not to let it live in the present tense anymore. I recognized it immediately, the way you recognize your own limp in someone else's walk. I did not say I was sorry. She was not looking for that, and I could feel it. What I said was, "You were 22. She said, "Yes." I said, and the man just kept on. She said, "They always do." She said it without heat. That was the thing that struck me, the complete absence of heat in it, which was not the absence of feeling but the presence of something that had moved beyond feeling into a kind of bedrock knowing. She had catalogued the fact of the world's behavior and had decided to navigate accordingly, and the navigation did not require her to keep burning about it. I respected that more than I expected to. That recognition, the mutual recognition of 2 people who had both been taken apart by the world and had, through different means and over different years, managed to put enough back together to still be standing, was the beginning of things between us. Not pity. She would have burned down any pity I offered, and I would not have offered it because I could see clearly that she did not need it, not some romantic notion of shared suffering. Just the acknowledgement, in the direct way of people who have learned to see clearly, that we could see each other without the gloss that people who hadn't been taken apart tended to put on things. The agency was a particular kind of hell. I want to be accurate about that so you understand what we were both living inside of during the years that follow. It was not violent mostly. It was something that takes more explaining than violence does. It was the daily work of making you small. The rations that were never quite enough and were always late. The agents who could not look you in the eye and say your real name and who talked about you in the third person while you were standing in front of them. The rules, the endless rules, designed not for any functional purpose, but to remind you at every turn that you were being administered, managed, counted and recounted. Your presence a problem to be solved by people who found the solving tedious. The worst of it for me was not hunger or boredom or indignity. The worst of it was watching my people learn to be smaller, watching young men who had grown up with a certain carriage in their shoulders gradually let the shoulders round. The way a horse that has been kept in a small pen long enough will stop testing the fence. The agency wanted broken people because broken people are easier, and it had all the time and all the resources it needed to do the breaking, and it was patient, and most of the time it won. I watched this and I couldn't stop it, and I had been the one who brought us here, and I had done the calculation, and I had been right, and I would make the same decision again, and it still felt like a thing I would spend the rest of my life trying to carry. The lamp was almost out. That's the truest way I know to say it. I was doing the days, getting through them, the morning to night of it. I still made sure the band's concerns got heard when they needed to be heard, still went to the agent's office when something needed pushing, still knew who was hungry and who was sick and what needed doing, but I was running on the rails of duty, not on anything that felt alive underneath. There was a bottle, too, by then. I'll be honest about that. Not all the time and not the way some men went, completely down into it, but more than I should have. The agency whiskey that the traders sold illegally and everyone knew about and nobody stopped because a few drunk Indians were easier to manage than sober ones. I didn't like what it did to me. I didn't like who I was in the mornings, but I liked what it did to the space between my ears at night, which is the reason men keep going back to things they don't like. Chaska knew about the bottle. She didn't say anything for a long time. She watched, the way she watched everything, with that dark still eye that didn't miss much. We had become something by then. Friends is too small a word and I don't have the right word in either language. Companions, maybe. People who ate together sometimes, who talked sometimes, who did not have to perform anything for each other. The pretense you maintain even on a reservation, the version of yourself you show the world, I didn't have to do that with her. She had already seen me on a bad morning. She had already been there on the day I went to the agent's office and came back and sat outside my door for 2 hours not talking to anyone. And she had brought me water and sat nearby and not said a word and then gone home. And that had been, strange as it sounds, one of the things that kept the lamp from going entirely dark. Not what she said, what she didn't say. I think there was something between us that wanted to be more than that. I think we both knew it and neither of us had named it. I was not sure I had the right to name it. A man who is dying inside, even slowly, a man who has let the lamp go down to almost nothing. That man has no business reaching toward a woman with what he has left. I think she knew that too. I think she was waiting for me to become something worth reaching back toward. And I think she was not certain I was going to. I was not certain either. Those months, the fall of 1881 and on into that winter, were in some ways the quietest I'd known since surrendering to the agency, and quiet was not a comfort. It had the quality of a held breath. The band was stable, if stable is the right word for people who are being compressed slowly by forces they cannot push back against. The agent that winter was a man named Purvis, better than some, worse than others, the kind of man who followed the rules not from conviction, but from an absence of the courage required to break them in either direction. He did not steal from the rations, which put him ahead of his predecessor. He also did not do anything that was not explicitly required of him, which meant every improvement, every extra consideration, every small dignity had to be extracted from the process by someone willing to push, and the pushing fell to me. I went to his office most weeks. I sat in the chair across from his desk, and I made the case for whatever needed making, and he listened with his pen hovering over his ledger, and he wrote things down and filed them in the way that things got filed and generally nothing happened. I kept going back. That is the only move available when the first move doesn't work. Go back. Go back more prepared. Find a different angle. Find the specific word in the specific document that creates the specific obligation you need him to acknowledge. I was good at it. I had been good at it for years, reading the language of agreements the way I'd once read terrain. But it wore on me, the way any work wears on you when it returns less than it costs. I was spending more of myself than I was getting back, and I had less to spend every season. There was a nephew of mine, a young man named Chayton, maybe 23 that winter, who had been a promising boy when we came to the agency and was being progressively ruined by it. I watched it happening and couldn't name a specific moment to intervene. It was nothing dramatic, just the slow withdrawal. He stopped talking much. He stopped volunteering for things. He sat for long stretches doing nothing, which was not his nature. He had been a restless, curious boy, always wanting to know how things worked, and the nothing sitting was visible as a symptom without any obvious cure. Chaska noticed too. One evening she said to me without preamble, "That boy needs a task that matters." I said, there isn't much left that matters. She said, that is not true. What you do matters. Bring him along. I thought about it overnight. In the morning I went to Chayton and I told him I needed someone to keep records at the agent's office meetings. Not the agent's records, our own records in our own language. So we had our own account of what was said and promised and written. I told him the job required a man who could write clearly in both languages and who was sharp enough to catch the gap between what was said and what was meant. He had the straightness back in his back within a week. Small thing, entirely necessary. I told Chaska. She said, good, with the tone of someone who already knew this was the obvious outcome. The thing that broke it open happened in the February of 1882, dead winter. The creek was frozen and the ground was iron, and the cottonwoods along the creek bank stood up like bones. I had been sick for 3 weeks, nothing serious, a chest cold that had gotten into my lungs and wouldn't leave, and I'd spent most of those 3 weeks in the cabin with the bottle and my own company, and neither of us doing much good for the other. On the morning I'm thinking of, I woke up and the bottle was empty and there was frost on the inside of the window, and I lay there on the blankets and I thought, I am done. Not done with anything in particular, done in general, the general done, the kind that has no specific plan attached to it, just a settled, quiet sense that there is no further reason to get up. That the lamp has finally gone out completely, and there is nothing left to relight it with. I lay there for a long time. The light came in through the frosted window, the thin winter light that has no warmth in it, and I watched it move across the floor the way you watch things when you have decided to be finished with watching them. The frost on the glass made the light come in broken, scattered, and I watched the broken pieces of it on the plank floor for a long time. I was thinking, in a loose and directionless way, about my father. About the way he looked the last morning I saw him, which was the morning before the smallpox took its final hold. He had looked at me with a clarity that I now understand was the clarity of a man who knows he is leaving and is trying to give you something before he goes. The 3 things. The 3 things he told me. I lay there on the floor of that government-built cabin, and I thought about all 3 of them, and I thought, I have failed them all and the failing is done. Then there was a knock at the door. I didn't answer. The door opened anyway. She came in without being asked, which was entirely like her, and which was one of the things I had once found aggravating and had come around to depending on. She looked at me on the floor with the empty bottle and the frost on the window and whatever was in my face right then, and she didn't say anything for a moment. She stood in the door she'd pushed open with the cold February behind her and the thin light on her, and she looked at me with both eyes, the good one and the scarred one, and something in the stillness of her face shifted. Not pity, I want to be clear, not pity. If there had been pity in her face, I believe I would have turned to the wall. It was something harder than pity and more honest than sympathy. It was the recognition again, the same one we'd had early on, except this time it was tinged with something I can only describe as refusal. The refusal in her face. The flat, certain no. She said in Lakota, "You are not going to do this." I said nothing. She came fully into the cabin and closed the door behind her and crouched down to where I was and looked at my face for a long moment, and then she said, "I did not survive what was done to me so that you could lie down on the floor of a government-built cabin and decide to be finished." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't tender. It was the most direct statement of self-interest I had ever heard someone make on behalf of someone else, which is also the most generous thing I have ever had said to me, because it meant, your being alive matters to me personally for my own reasons, not for yours, for mine. I looked at her for a long time. I said, "Chaska, I am empty." She said, "I know, get up anyway." I said, "You don't understand, there is nothing left." She said, "I didn't ask if there was anything left. I said, get up." There is a kind of woman who carries a certain authority, not because anyone gave it to her but because she took it, and it comes not from volume or from forcefulness but from a bedrock certainty that she will not be moved from the thing she has decided. You can feel it like a weight, like a hand on your shoulder that is not asking. I felt it then. I had felt it from her before, in smaller things, but not like this. Not aimed at me directly, like a fire turned toward a cold room. I got up. Not gracefully, not with any dignity attached to it. I sat up and then I got my legs under me, and I stood up in that cold cabin with my lungs still half sick and the bottle empty on the floor, and I stood there. She looked at me standing there, and something went through her face, fast, gone, that I did not know what to do with. Something warm and relieved and private. Then it was gone, and she was already moving to the wood stove to check if there was anything left in it to coax. I stood there and breathed. That was the beginning. What came after that was not a simple thing. I want to be careful not to make it sound simpler than it was, because the whole truth is the only version worth telling. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Not to tend me, not to mother me. I would not have stood for that, and she would not have offered it. She came back to talk. Sometimes about practical things, the band's problems, the agent's latest idiocy, the state of the horses, which old woman needed firewood. Sometimes she talked about her people, the ones she'd come in with, the ones she'd lost before that. Sometimes I talked. Sometimes neither of us did. She cooked sometimes. I am not a man who makes much of food. You eat because you need to. That was my attitude, and it still mostly is. But when she cooked, she did something to ordinary things that made them taste like they were worth paying attention to. And I found after a while that I started paying attention to meals, which sounds small and is not small. The bottle went away gradually. She didn't make an issue of it, and I didn't announce it. I just found over the weeks that I was reaching for it less, and then that I was not reaching for it, and then that I did not want it anymore. The wanting had been about the noise in the hollow place, and the hollow place was starting to fill slowly, the way a pool fills in a dry season when the rain finally comes back. Not quickly, not all at once, drop by drop. I started going back to the council meetings. I started listening again, really listening, not just sitting in the room. Old Washday had been managing things in my absence badly, not because he was stupid, but because he was cautious to the point of paralysis, and the agent had learned to use that cautiousness against him. I came back to the meetings and I started pushing again, the way I used to push, and a few things moved that hadn't been moving. Not everything, not enough, but some things, and some things is not nothing. The band noticed. I could feel it, the way your people feel when the man who's supposed to be in front of them is actually in front of them again. A settling. Not dramatic, just a reorientation, the way a compass needle swings back when you take the magnet away. I did not let myself feel too much about this, because the machinery was fragile still, and I had learned enough about myself to know that feeling too much too soon was a way of breaking it again. But I noticed. Chaitin noticed too. He came to me one afternoon in early March, the first week when the air smelled like something other than frozen ground, and he said, "Uncle, you are back." I said, "I am back." He said, "I was not sure you were going to be." I said, "Neither was I." He stood there with the straightness in his back that had been returning over the months, and he looked at me with the directness his mother had used, and he said, "Was it her?" He meant Chaska. Everybody could see what nobody had named yet. I said, "Partly." The rest was deciding not to give the agency the satisfaction. That made him laugh, a surprised, caught-breath laugh, the way young men laugh when something is truer than they expected. I stood there and let myself feel that for a moment. The lamp was burning again. Spring came. The creek broke up and ran clear and fast for 2 weeks and then settled into itself. The cottonwoods leafed out. I started sleeping through the nights, which I had not been doing. The lungs cleared. There was an evening in April, one of the first warm evenings, the kind where the winter has finally admitted it's done, when Chaska and I were sitting outside my cabin on 2 upturned crates that served as chairs, and the sun was going down somewhere behind the hills and turning the sky the color of an old wound slowly healing, red and orange, and then the deep bruised purple at the edges, and neither of us was saying anything. She had a shawl around her shoulders, her hands were in her lap, she was looking at the sky. I had been watching her, the left side of her face, the way I found myself watching it sometimes, not because of the scar but because of what was around the scar, the architecture of the rest of it, the strong line of her jaw, the way the skin around the eye on that side had its own geography now that was nothing like the other side and was, to my mind, nothing like anything I'd ever seen on anyone else. Something original, something that was entirely and only her. She knew I was watching, she always knew. She turned and looked at me. The light was on her, and the scar was fully visible, and her expression was the one she used when she was waiting to see what a person was going to do next. I reached out and put my thumb, very gently, on the sealed edge of the bad lid. I don't know why I did it. It wasn't a thought. It was just a thing my hand did slowly without rushing, and she let me do it. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched me with the good eye, and I held my thumb there for a moment on the drawn skin of the lid, and I felt the warmth of her face under my hand and the slight give of old scar tissue. And then I leaned forward and I put my mouth there, just briefly, my lips on the closed lid. Not a thing with any pressure in it, just a placement. A touch. Then I sat back. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, quietly, in a voice I had not heard her use before, lower, without the usual armor in it, "No one has ever done that." I said, "I know." She said, "Why did you?" I thought about it. I said, "Because someone should have a long time ago." The sun finished going down. The purple at the edges of the sky deepened and the first stars came through. Neither of us moved. After a while she reached across the space between the two crates and she took my hand in both of hers. Her hands were rough from work, from cold, from everything she'd carried. She held my hand and she looked up at the stars coming in and she did not say anything else. I sat there with her hands around mine, and I felt something I had not felt in 6 years. Not happiness, I don't want to lie and say happiness, something more durable than happiness, something that sits lower. The sense, not a thought, more physical than that I was in the right place at the right time with the right person, and that this was real, and that real things can hold you when you cannot hold yourself. That was the first night I felt like a living man again. The summer of 1882 was hard in the way that all summers on the reservation were hard, the rations short, the agent corrupt in the specific way that agency agents tended to be corrupt, which was not dramatically or entertainingly, but in small, grinding, bureaucratic ways that were harder to fight because they were never clearly one thing. A form filed late, a delivery that came up short, a permission withheld without explanation and without recourse. I was back fully now, in the sense that mattered. I was back in the room. I was back in front of my people when they needed someone in front of them. I went to the agent's office so many times that summer that his assistant, a young man from Pennsylvania who I think genuinely wanted to do something decent in his position, and was blocked at every turn, started leaving a chair out for me. There was a particular situation that summer that I want to tell you about, because it shows you something, and because Chaska was in the middle of it in a way that I did not know until after. 3 families from my band had been farming a strip of land along the creek that was, by the terms of our particular allotment, supposed to be available for communal farming. The agent had decided, without consultation and without any legal basis that I could find, to reassign half of that strip to a white settler from Nebraska who had arrived on the reservation claiming some form of preemption, right that the agent seemed disposed to honor. The settler, his name was Greer, a heavy-set man with a red face and an attitude of aggrieved ownership toward things that weren't his, had already moved his equipment onto the southern part of the strip and had made it plain that he considered the matter settled. The 3 families came to me. I went to the agent. The agent referred me to a process that would take months. The families could not wait months. The land was planting season now, or it wasn't planting season at all. I pushed on the agent. I found the specific language in our allotment agreement, and I pushed on it hard, and I kept coming back, and I was as aggressive as I could be within the language of the process, because stepping outside the language of the process was what they wanted, because outside the process they could simply call the soldiers. I did not give them that. I stayed inside the language and I kept pushing, and it went nowhere for 3 weeks. What I did not know was what Chaska was doing in those same 3 weeks. She had found out, through one of the young women in the agency office, a mixed-blood woman named Adiz who did the clerical work and had access to certain documents, that Greer's claim was not a preemption right at all but a private arrangement with the agent, an exchange of money for the use of land the agent had no authority to reassign. Adiz had copied the relevant pages. Chaska had taken those pages to the government inspector who happened to be passing through the region on an unrelated audit, a dry and careful man named Hollies, who turned out to be the rare kind of government man who actually believed in the rules and was genuinely put out when people broke them. I didn't know any of this until Hollies appeared in the agent's office 2 days after I had gone there for the 9th time that week, and things began, very suddenly, to move. Greer's equipment came off the land. The agent was formally investigated. The land went back to the 3 families in time for a late planting. The agent was not removed, they rarely were, but he was constrained, and for the rest of that year he was considerably more careful. When I found out what Chaska had done, I stood outside her door for a while before I knocked, because I needed a minute to put my face in order. She answered the door and looked at me with the patient look of someone who has been expecting this. I said, "How long were you working on that?" She said, 3 weeks. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She said, "Because you were already doing everything you could through the front door. I was working through the back. We were both working on the same house." I stood there a moment. I said, "You took a risk. Adiz took a risk. If Hollies had been the other kind of government man." She said, "I know. I thought it through. I decided the risk was worth it." I said, "It was my fight." She said, "It was our people's fight. You don't own our people's fights." She was not wrong about that. I said, "Chaska." She said, "What?" I said, "I don't know what I would do without you." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, in the careful voice of someone choosing words very deliberately, "You would do most of it. You would do the hard parts. But you would do them alone, and there's a difference." I said, "Yes, there is." She held the door open. I went inside. The fall of that year, October. The nights were cold again, the first stars showing up earlier and earlier, that particular blue dark of an autumn evening on the plains, when the air loses the day's warmth all at once, and the sky feels very tall. We were walking the creek. We did that sometimes in the evenings. Neither of us was much for sitting still. She said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it fully before you say anything." I said, "All right." She said, "I am going to stay here. I am not going anywhere. I am here with you if you want me here. I want you to know that." I stopped walking. She stopped a step ahead of me and turned and looked at me. She said, "I have watched you come back from a place most men don't come back from. I have watched you go to that agent's office and fight with nothing but words and keep going back and keep going back, and I have watched you be in front of your people when it cost you, and I know what it costs. I know who you are. I have been looking at you very clearly, and I know who you are, and I am here." The creek moved beside us in the dark. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, something small moved through the dead leaves. I said, "I am not the man I was." She said, "No, you are not. You are a different man. I am not in love with the man you were. I did not know that man. I know this one." I did not have any words for a while. I said, "I was empty when you found me." She said, You are not empty now." I said, because of you. She said, because of both of us. Because you got up off the floor when I told you to. Don't give me more than I'm owed. I took her face in both my hands. Both sides of it, the smooth and the damaged, my palms cupped around her jaw and the winter cold on the backs of my hands. I felt the scar tissue under my right thumb and the warmth of her skin over the cheekbone on the other side, and I stood there looking at her in the dark. She put her hands over mine, both of them holding my hands to her face. She said, "You are a good man, Lakota. I don't say things I don't mean." No, she didn't. That was one of the things I had learned about her. One of the first things, that every word she said was a word she'd chosen and meant and would stand behind. And she said very few words she wasn't sure of. So when she said them, they landed. I have been told I was a good man only a handful of times in my life. Twice by my father. Once by an old warrior I respected greatly, in circumstances where it was not easy to say. Once by my wife Winona, years ago, on a morning after a bad night when saying it cost her something. And now by this woman, on the bank of a half-frozen creek on a dark October night, her face in my hands and her hands over mine, the stars showing up overhead one by one, and her voice quiet and sure, and without any softness in it that didn't belong there. It went into me differently than anything had gone in for a very long time. I said, "I am not going to tell you that what happened to you was part of some plan or that it led you to something worth the cost. I don't believe that and I won't say it." She said, "Good," I would have walked away. I said, "But I am going to tell you that I am glad you are alive. I am going to tell you that every morning when I get up now, I get up for reasons, and you are part of those reasons, and I did not have that before you." She was quiet. The creek made its sound. She was quiet for long enough that I started to wonder. Then she said, "That's enough. That's enough for me." I brought her in and held her for a while, just standing on the creek bank in the cold, and she let me. And I felt her weight against me, real and solid and alive. And the night was very still, and the stars were very clear, and the cold was the kind of cold that sharpens everything at the edges and makes the world feel exact and real. I thought about my father's third thing. The hardest thing you will ever do is stay when everything in you says to run. He was right, but he had not told me the second half of it. He had not told me that the staying, when you finally managed it, had a weight to it, a good weight, the weight of something built, something real. He probably thought I would find that out for myself. We were married in the late spring of 1883. It was not a large affair. We were not young people doing the ceremony for the first time, and neither of us had much patience for spectacle. An old man named Wanbley, who had been a holy man in his time, performed the ceremony in his manner, and the band was present, and that was enough. More than enough. Washday, the old headman who had been managing things in my long absence, came to me before the ceremony and shook my hand and held it for a moment and said, "You came back. I want you to know that I see it." He was not a sentimental man. I took the words at their full weight. The agent attended out of what I assumed was a mixture of cautious diplomacy and personal curiosity, and stood on the edge of things with his hat in his hands, looking like a man trying to figure out the right expression. I did not speak to him. He was not the point of the day. Chaska wore a dress her grandmother had made. She had kept it through everything, the years at different agencies, the surrenders, the moves, everything, rolled in a piece of oiled canvas at the bottom of whatever bundle she was carrying. She had told me once in passing that it was the only thing she had kept that had belonged to that life. I understood exactly what she meant by that. She was not a woman who showed emotion in ways you could easily read. She was not the kind of woman who cried at things, or who let what she was feeling move across her face freely. She had a life that had taught her the value of managing what showed, and she had learned that lesson completely. But when Wanbley said the words and she stood there in her grandmother's dress with the spring wind moving her hair and the cottonwoods leafed out green behind her, She reached out and took my hand before she was supposed to, before the ceremony called for it, and she held it hard enough that I could feel the specific pressure of each finger. I held her hand back. The band made the sound they make at such times. The old women, the children, someone's horse somewhere behind the camp answering for reasons of its own. I looked at her face in the spring light, and the scar was there as it always was, and I did not see it any differently than the rest of her face, which is to say I saw it fully and clearly as a part of her, as one of the things that made the particular geography of her, as nothing to be looked past or around, but something to be looked at directly and held. She squeezed my hand. I was 52 years old, and I had been emptied and I had been refilled, and I was standing in the spring with a woman who had seen me clearly and chosen what she saw, and the sky was very high and very blue, and the ground under my feet was solid. My father had been right. The staying was the hardest thing. It was also the only thing. I am an old man now. I have to be clear that when I tell this story, the telling comes from a long way back, decades back, and some of the details have the softness that time puts on details, and some of them are as sharp as the day they happened, the way certain things are. The cold on the backs of my hands on that October night on the creek bank, the specific pressure of her fingers before the ceremony, the sound my own voice made when I said what I said to her on the floor of the cabin, I am empty, and the sound her voice made when she said, I know. Get up anyway. We had years, not easy years. The reservation life did not become simple because we had each other, and I want to be careful not to suggest otherwise, because that would be dishonest, and the truth is what I have to offer. The agency remained the agency. The fighting continued in the way it continued, not with guns anymore, but with papers, with processes, with the slow grind of trying to hold onto something real against systems that were designed to take it away. There were victories and there were losses, and there were long stretches where it was hard to tell which was which. But we were two people together, which is different from one person alone. I had known that as a younger man with Winona, and I had forgotten it during the hollow years, and she gave it back to me, not as a tender thing, as a working thing, a structural thing. The difference between a single post and two posts braced against each other, either one alone holds until it doesn't. The two together hold considerably longer and under considerably more weight. She was never soft with me, and I did not want soft. She was honest and present and capable and loyal in a way that had a spine in it. That was not loyalty because she had no options, but loyalty because she had looked at her options and chosen. That is a different thing. That is the thing worth having. Her eye did not get better. I would not have wanted it to exactly, because it was hers, because the whole of her face was hers and the scar was part of the whole, and you do not improve on the whole by taking out a part of it. What I mean is I stopped seeing it as a lack. I stopped being aware of it as a thing apart from her face. It was her face, the same way everything else was her face, and it was the face I knew better than any other face in the world, and it was the face I was glad to wake up next to in the cold mornings when the light came in through the window and everything outside was still quiet. There were mornings I would be awake before her, lying there in the dark before the light came, and I could hear her breathing beside me. Just that. The sound of her breathing, slow and even. And I would lie there, and I would think about the floor of the cabin and the empty bottle and the thin winter light, and how close it had been. And then I would think about the knock on the door and her coming in without being asked and crouching down and looking at me and saying what she said. And I would understand again, the way you understand things in the dark when you are very still, that the distance between what was and what is, between lying on that floor and lying in this bed with this woman breathing beside me, was a distance that she had dragged me across, and that I had dragged myself across with whatever she'd handed me in that moment, and that neither of us could have done it alone. She used to say, in the years when the telling became one of the things between us, the old stories, the way older people share their old stories, that she had not decided to save me that February morning so much as she had decided she was not going to permit a certain outcome. She made a distinction between those two things that I came to understand. Saving implies the other person is helpless. She did not think I was helpless. She thought I was lying on the floor making a bad decision, and she had come to correct the decision, and the rest was mine to do. I think that is the truest version of it. I think she is right that the rest was mine to do. I got up. I did the work. I came back to myself and to my people, and I did it with my own legs under me. But she was the one who opened the door without being asked. And she was the one who came back the next morning. And the morning after that. And on the creek bank in October she was the one who said, "You are a good man, and I know what you are, and I am here." A man can do a great many things on his own. I have done many things on my own, and I have no complaints about my own capabilities. But there is a thing that is done for you when a woman who has seen you clearly, who has not looked away from any of it, who has had every reason the world could provide to protect herself and stay at a certain distance, when that woman stands on a creek bank in the cold and says, "I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and I know what you are, and I choose it." There is a thing that does that nothing else does. A man who has had that is a wealthy man in the way that counts. I am by any measure a wealthy man. The last thing I want to tell you. Some years later, this would be in the late 1880s, after things had settled into the particular shape they were going to keep for a long time, one of the young men in the band, a man of about 25, came to me with something on his face that I recognized. Not the grief specifically, his was different from mine, but the shape of it. The way it sits on a person. The way the eyes go. His wife had died in childbed. The child had not survived. He had been walking around for 2 months doing the outward motions, and I could see what was under the outward motions. I did not give him a speech. I am not a man who gives speeches. I sat with him and I told him about the floor of the cabin and the empty bottle and the February morning and the knock at the door. I told him about getting up. I told him it did not feel like anything the morning I got up. I told him the feeling came later and slowly, and that slow was all right. He sat there and listened. He did not say much. When he left, I watched him walk across the camp and I thought about how a thing travels. How something that was done for you can be passed along not in the doing of the original thing, but in the saying of it, in the showing of it, in the sitting down next to someone on the floor and saying, "I know what this is, and you are going to get up, and I will sit here while you decide." Chaska was standing behind me. I had not heard her come out. She said, "Good." Just that good. I said, he needed to hear it from someone who had been there. She said, he needed to hear it from you specifically. I said, why specifically me? She said, because you are someone who came all the way back. Not everyone does. He needed to see that it was possible. I turned and looked at her. The late light on her face and the scar in the late light and her eyes on mine, the good one and the damaged one, both of them steady and clear. I said, it was possible because of you. She said, it was possible because you are who you are. I only opened the door. We stood there in the late light. The camp moved around us, the ordinary movements of evening, fire smoke and children's voices and horses shifting at their lines, and above it all the sky going from blue to the first deep purple of approaching night, and the stars beginning. She took my arm, we walked. The ground was solid under our feet. That is all.